Hello, Professor Mendez-Escobar here. In this video, I'll be going over the Child Development 101 Key Assessment titled Observing Early Childhood Development and Learning. In my courses, I refer to this assignment as the Child Observation and Interpretation paper. However, you want to confirm with your instructor and the syllabus provided to you about the exact name that's used in your course. This video, I will be going over the different parts and sharing with you some of my recommendations for completion of the assignment. However, I do want to emphasize that this video does not replace the assignment directions that are provided to you or what your instructor would like for you to do. Alrighty, let's get started. For your observation, you are going to be observing a child ages 3 to 5. Your focus is going to be on one child, even if that child is interacting with those around them. As you talk about development, you're focusing on that one child. It's important that you have no personal relationship with this child, which means that they are not your own child, you are not their teacher, and the purpose of this is so that you are able to remain objective, because your role is to observe, not interact. You also want to ensure that the child is active, meaning that they are engaged in an activity that is not sedentary, so they're not sitting down, watching TV, or playing on a tablet. This will allow for you to be able to fully observe their development. In terms of the setting, you want to make sure that you are observing the child in a naturalistic setting, such as a home or a park, or a licensed early childhood program. Before you go to observe, you want to ask when is the best time to go. And the reason why you want to do this is you want to make sure that you're not going to observe the child while they are napping or during their rest time. As you complete your observation hours, you want to make sure that you're filling out the hours log and providing the observation request letter to the caregiver. Both the hours log and the observation request letter are going to be shared with you by your instructor or already included for you on Brightspace. What you are submitting at the end of your completion of this assignment is the completed hours log, and then depending on your instructor, they may also ask you to complete the notes. To submit the notes, which are parts 1 and 3, and then you're also submitting your actual paper, which is part 4. If you are my student, you are going to be submitting all of these things. So, this is what you're going to be doing for this assessment. These are the 4 parts. You have the observation, pre-reflection setting notes, the child observation, the child observation notes, and your observation interpretation paper. Those are the 4 parts. So when you're thinking about the notes, that's parts 1 and 3. The actual child observation is part 2, and then the paper is part 4. When you go over to Brightspace, it might look like this. And again, this depends on your instructor and how they have set up their Brightspace, or if they use it for this assessment. Once you scroll down here, you're going to find the actual assignment, which has the basic overview, which includes the 4 parts, a detailed assignment description, and then detailing each part. Part 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you click on the actual assignment, you will also see, this is where you go to submit it, you will also see this link here that you can open up, and you will be able to see the full assignment description and for all of the parts and the grading rubric. So let's go ahead and click on that. That'll take you to this document where you have more details, starting in the top with the NACCE standard, and these are the standards for which you'll be assessed for this assignment. Again, all of the information that's already there for you on Brightspace. One thing to note is that you will see these small numbers, which are also on Brightspace, and they are actually footnotes for explaining specific terms. And if you click on the terms, it'll also take you to a website where you can find more information. And if you keep scrolling down, then you will see the grading rubric. Heading back to Brightspace, you also have access to the grading rubric down here. Okay, so that's what's on Brightspace. So now let's go back and talk about each of the parts. Okay, so part 1 is the observation pre-reflection setting notes. The whole point of this part is to provide some context for the observation, such as including, where you're observing the child, your relationship with the child, the age of the child, who's present while you're observing, any information that you might gather about contextual factors such as race, ethnicity, language, ability, socioeconomic status, religion, etc. And you want to make sure that you're describing these contextual factors in objective language. And these are some questions that you will most likely need the help of the caregiver to answer. And again, the caregiver is whoever is there with the child. And it could also be the teacher. And if you are in an early care and education center, then this might be information that you can gather from the director or the front office staff who might know the child and their family. Also, for this part, you want to make sure that you provide any other information that the reader should know about the context in which this observation is taking place. These notes, you want to complete them before you start observing. And there are some of these questions that you might need to answer after you arrive to where you're going to be observing the child, particularly those in which you would need to ask the caregiver for some more information. And then part 2 is the actual child observation, where you're going to go with your hours log and the observation request letter to provide to the caregiver. And then part 3 are the notes that you take while you're there. So you're going to choose the child that you're going to focus on. In some cases, particularly if you're going to be observing the child in a naturalistic setting, you already know who the child is going to be. And you want to try to be a fly on the wall. So be as unobtrusive or uninvolved in the interactions with the child because you want to make sure that you remain objective. You want to write what you see and what you hear in a way that is accurate, concise, and objective. And again, you want to make sure that you're checking the assignment description on Brightspace or provided to you by your instructor, because that has really specific detailed information about what you need to write about. In this case, you want to just write everything the child is saying and doing during the observation. Be unobtrusive, as I mentioned earlier. And for at least a portion of your observation, you want to try to be as close to the child as possible so that you can see and hear them clearly. And very important as well is to be able to capture descriptions of the child's physical, cognitive, language, and social emotional domains, which also include play. Now, my recommendation is that since you should be observing this child on at least 2 occasions, or at least more than 1. So you want to make sure that you write down as much information as possible and not get too bogged down trying to interpret it at the moment. And between visits, you can review your class notes, the textbook, or any other resources provided to you by your instructor so that you can determine what else you need to focus on. So let's say you went and you did your observation and you had a lot of good notes about physical, language, development, and social emotional. However, you didn't get enough on cognitive. That way, when you go back, that can be the focus of what you are observing. And you also want to make sure that you make note of the interactions that the child has with materials or other people within the environment. And again, you want to make sure that you write as much as possible so that later, when you have to organize your notes and write about development, you've got the most information that you were possibly able to gather. So I kind of already mentioned some of this as I was looking through the actual assignment description. So I'm going to skip over. So part 4, that's your observation paper. So this is a typed paper or report, depending on how it's referenced in your course. You're using 12-inch font, double-spaced. I highly recommend that you give yourself enough time to write this, at least 2 weeks, so that you can write it, ask questions about content or where you're stuck with your instructor, and then also give you the opportunity to edit by going to see a writing tutor at the Writing Center, or if you're an online student, using the Smart Thinking feature that's provided where you can have some writing support. This is a lot. You're going to be writing about development, and this might also be the first time you do this type of paper, and it can be overwhelming. And I find that if you give yourself enough time to organize your notes, write your paper in chunks, and be able to have time to edit, ask follow-up questions, then you will be able to complete this paper. It's important to note that for the paper, there are several parts, and you need to write about all of them. Let's jump back to Brightspace so that you can take a look at those parts. Okay, so here it is in part 4, and it tells you specifically that you are to interpret and analyze your child observation notes based on what you've learned so far in your course. You want to make sure that you clearly demonstrate your ability to use observation and documentation and other assessment approaches in order to be able to write about development. So the paper has 5 sections. What I like about the way that the instructions for this paper have been laid out is that this gives you a really good outline. So you don't necessarily need to spend that much time thinking about what you're going to include in your paper, because it's already been outlined for you. So there are these 5 different sections, and as you can see, each of them has really detailed, specific requirements of what you need to include. So that's what I mean by it's a lot. It has a lot of parts, and you need to make sure that you cover all of them. One of the ways that I like to describe this assignment to my students is that up to now, you've learned about development, or you're still in the course, you're still learning about development. And with this paper, you want to be able to observe some of those things that you've been learning. So, observing some concepts in action, or being able to see a child behavior, or any aspect of their development, and then be able to interpret that using some of these theories that you are learning. And always the focus should be on, you need to show that you're understanding development and that you can use observation to illustrate your understanding. So instead of spending a lot of time writing about what you observed and very little interpreting, you want to kind of flip that over and thinking about more of being really specific. So for example, if you look at part 2A, you're providing an overview of what you observed in each developmental domain, but you need to be sure that you're using developmental theory and milestones to explain what you observed. So those are some of the ways that you show that you understand development. And just to note, as you're looking through this, just because it's one letter, section here, that does not mean that it's like just one paragraph. Because if you provide an overview of what you observed in each developmental domain, that can very easily be 3 separate paragraphs for the 3 separate domains. so here I've summarized each of the parts for you, but that's why I say it's the subparts for you. That's why I said it's really important that you go back and you look at the actual assignment description so that you know all of the areas that you need to include in your paper, because that's what you'll be assessed on. So the first part, this first section rather, I don't want to use parts because this is part 4, so let's use the word section. So the first section, section 1, is your introduction. So that's where you're summarizing some of the child's characteristics and the setting where the observation was completed. To complete this section, you're going to use your pre-reflection setting notes. Okay. And then to complete section 2, which is the developmental observation analysis, you're going to largely focus on your child observation notes. This section is your objective summary of what you observed. So you start off with an overview of the 3 domains with discussion of course content to explain and interpret what you saw. Next, you're going to provide 3 specific examples of how the child's development met or deviated away from expected milestones. You can include this in its own separate paragraph, or you can combine 2A and 2B together. It really depends on how you're structuring your paper. And then you also want to make sure that you provide 3 specific examples of how developmental domains interrelated. That is, what are some specific examples where you were able to observe physical, cognitive language, social, emotional, all happening at the same time, or not happening, but being evidenced at the same time. And then the following sections are providing contextual factors that influence the development of the child. So how do these contextual factors such as race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, how do they influence the development of the child? And this is where you are going to be able to show off your understanding of how these factors have a potential for influencing development. What are some of the ways that you're understanding how they can impact development? Then you want to move to a description of protective factors. So what are some of these protective factors that are present in the child's life that can buffer stress? So are they, positive parent-child relationship? Is it that the child is in a high-quality early care program? What are some of these protective factors? And then you also want to make sure that you include recommendations for further assessment if needed. And sometimes students tell me, well, I found that the child did not deviate from any of their expected milestones, and I didn't see any concerns in terms of their development. So if you feel that there are no further assessment is needed, then explain why not. Okay, and that's where you talk about how they, met their milestones. However, if we go back. So, for example, remember in section 2B where you are providing 3 specific examples of how the child's development either met or deviated away from expected milestones? If you indicated there were some examples in which the child deviated from milestones, when you get to the recommendations section, then you're going to make recommendations that are going to support development in those areas where the child deviated from expected milestones. Also in this section, you're going to reflect on how using observation as an assessment tool was like, because what you are doing is you're systematically observing a child. There's key things that you are looking for, and then you're interpreting their development. So that's a systematic observation, and that's used to assess, right? So you want to then reflect on that process and what that was like for you. And even though it's not in the instructions, you also want to include a conclusion. So if you're in my course, then you would have that as well. But again, I don't think every instructor requires that. So that's an overview of this paper, again, of this assessment. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is not intended to replace the assessment instructions or what your instructor asks of you. So you always want to make sure that you confirm what it is that you need to complete for this assessment. Rather, this video is just aimed at helping you think through how to complete the assessment with my recommendations. But again, what your instructor says is what goes. Alrighty, that's it for now. Thank you.